Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the past perfect simple and the past perfect continuous. If you don't understand something immediately, you can pause, rewind and rewatch. So now let's start with the past perfect simple. How is the past perfect simple formed? We use had and the past participle of the verb. Regular past participles are formed by adding ed to the verb, but irregular past participles have their own forms and we have to learn them by heart. So in a table of irregular verbs, the past participle is always the third column. For example, for regular verbs we use had and we add ed to the verb and we say, I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they had arrived. The short form of had is apostrophe D. We often use the short form in everyday speech and in formal writing. To make questions, we put had before the subject. Had I arrived? Had you arrived? Etc. To make negatives, we use had not or hadn't and the past participle. I had not arrived or I hadn't arrived, you hadn't arrived, etc. For irregular verbs, we use had and the irregular past participle. So for example, we say, I, you, he, she, it, had left, etc. In the question we say, had he left, had she left, had it left, and in the negative we say, he hadn't left, she hadn't left, it hadn't left, etc. In short answers we only use yes, no, the subject pronoun, and had or hadn't. For example, had he finished cleaning when you came in? Yes, he had. No, he hadn't. Now when do we use the past perfect simple? We use the past perfect simple to talk about an action which happened before another action in the past or before a specific time in the past. The past perfect shows the earlier action, the first action, and the past simple shows the later action, the second action. For example, the train had left before we arrived at the station. The train left earlier and we arrived later. Another example, she had done her homework by 6 o'clock. So she had done her homework before that specific time in the past. We also use the past perfect simple after the expression that was, it was, the first time, the second time, the third time, the only time, the last time. For example, it was the first time they had met. Now in this case, we use the past perfect as the past equivalent of the present perfect. So if we say, it is the first time they have met, we refer to the present. But when we say, it was the first time they had met, we refer to the past. Also, we use the past perfect after that was, it was, he was, etc., and the superlative form of the adjectives. For example, she was the most beautiful girl he had ever met. Again here, we use the past perfect as the past equivalent of the present perfect. So if we say, she is the most beautiful girl he has ever met, we refer to the present. But when we say she was the most beautiful girl he had ever met, we refer to the past. Now we also use the past perfect with I wish and if only to express regret for a past situation or action. I wish I hadn't eaten so much. If only I hadn't eaten so much. And we use it for the type 3 conditionals to express the unreal in the past. For example, if you had listened to my advice, you would not have been in trouble, but you didn't listen. Now let's look at some time expressions which are often used with the past perfect simple. We use by or by the time, before, and when. And we use before, when, and by the time before the past simple. For example, I had finished all the work by the time you called, or by 3 p.m. And by the time is followed by the simple past, by the time you called. Before I knew it, she had run out the door. Again, before is followed by the simple past, before I knew it. And then we say she had run out the door. Also, we use the past perfect with after, as soon as, till, until. And we use after, as soon as, until before using the past perfect simple. For example, I didn't say anything until she had finished talking. Until is followed by the past perfect. Already, just, never. These words go between had and the past participle. When we arrived, the movie had already started. I had just gone outside when it started to rain. We had never tried sushi before we went to Japan. For and since. We use for with a period of time, and we use since with a point in time. For example, when she graduated, she had been in London for 6 years. For 6 years is a period of time. Note, the simple past can be used instead of the past perfect simple after before, after, until, and as soon as. Why? Because these words show which action happened earlier and which action happened later. So for example, we say, we didn't leave the house until the rain stopped, or until the rain had stopped. Until shows the chronological order of the events. First the rain stopped, and then we left. We do need the past perfect to show which action happened first. Now let's look at the difference in meaning between the past perfect, the past continuous, and the past simple. The past perfect simple is used to talk about a past action which happened before another past action. For example, they had eaten dinner when their friends came. This means that they finished eating dinner before their friends came. Now, the past continuous is used to talk about a past action which was in progress when it was interrupted by another action by the simple past. For example, they were eating dinner when their friends came. Now, this means that they were eating dinner and their friends interrupted them. The past simple is used to talk about actions which happened immediately one after the other in the past. For example, they ate dinner when their friends came. Now this means that they ate dinner immediately after their friends came. So this is the difference between these three tenses. Let's go on to the past perfect continuous. The past perfect continuous is formed with had been and the ing form of the verb. For example, I had been sleeping, you had been sleeping, etc. The short form of had is apostrophe D. I'd been sleeping, you'd been sleeping, etc. To make questions, we put had before the subject. Had I been sleeping, had you been sleeping, etc. We make negatives with not after had. I had not been sleeping, or I hadn't been sleeping, you hadn't been sleeping, etc. In short answers, we only use yes or no, the subject pronoun, and had or hadn't. For example, had you been playing football? Yes, I had. No, I hadn't. Now, when do we use the past perfect continuous? We use it to describe an action that was in progress before another action happened. For example, he had been studying English for 2 years before he went to London. Now, the past action that was in progress is that he had been studying, and the other action in the past, the one that happened later, is that he went to London, and that's the simple past. We also use the past perfect continuous to talk about a past action with certain duration that had visible results at a later time in the past. For example, he had been studying all night. That's why he looked so tired the next morning. Now, notice that we use the past perfect continuous as the past equivalent of the present perfect continuous. That is, the past perfect continuous puts emphasis on the duration of an action which started in the past and continued up until another time in the past, whereas the present perfect continuous puts emphasis on the duration of an action which started in the past but continues up to the present. For example, he had been studying English for 2 years before he went to London. Now, both of these actions finished. He stopped studying English and he went to London also in the past. But when we say he has been studying English for 2 years, we mean that he is still studying English. Secondly, we use the past perfect continuous to show that the result of an action which happened in the past for some time was evident at a later time in the past, whereas we use the present perfect continuous to show that the result of an action which has recently finished is evident now. Let's compare these two examples. He had been studying all night. That's why he looked so tired the next morning. So he looked tired at a later time in the past, the next morning. Whereas in the second sentence we say he has been studying all night. He looks very tired. He looks tired now. Now, what is the difference between the past perfect simple and the past perfect continuous? Which one should we use? Now, we use the past perfect simple when the first action started in the past and ended before the second action began, whereas we use the past perfect continuous when the first action was still in progress when the second action began. Remember that both actions ended in the past. So let's compare these two examples. I had fed the dogs before I tripped and fell. This means that first I fed the dogs and then I fell. Now in the second example, I had been feeding the dogs when I tripped and fell. It means I was still feeding the dogs when I fell. Let's look at the stative verbs. Note that stative verbs cannot be used in any continuous tenses. We do not use the past perfect continuous with these verbs. We use the past perfect simple instead. So we say, up until that moment, I had never believed. We cannot say had been believing in astrology. We say the car had belonged to Mike for years before Maria bought it. We cannot say had been belonging because that's a stative verb. Finally, let's look at the time expressions that are often used with the past perfect continuous. We use for and since. It had been snowing for 2 hours before the roads were closed. We use how long to emphasize the duration. How long had he been waiting? Again, we emphasize the duration by using expressions such as all morning, all day, all night. For example, he fell asleep because he had been working all night. We use by the time, before, when, and we use these time expressions before the past simple. For example, by the time he found an umbrella, it had been raining for 10 minutes. He had been driving for hours before he arrived. I had been working at the company for 5 years when I got the promotion. And these are the sources I used. This is the end of the lesson. Thank you for your attention.